So let's go ahead and kick this off. First and foremost, hello to everyone out there, and thanks for joining today's Churn Zero Impact webinar. Today we are going to be discussing optimizing health scores to help you all drive predictable revenue using those health scoring metrics. To briefly introduce myself, my name is Regan Becker, and I'm an account executive here at Churn Zero. Looking forward to walking you through today's session. So our agenda today is pretty straightforward, but really want to cover how you can develop a framework that's going to better predict client outcomes using health scoring, and some of the areas as well where Churn Zero's customer success platform can help. So within that framework, I want to touch on a few things specifically, and really covering three main areas. So first and foremost, I want to talk about creating a baseline health score, or what we call here churn scores, so that we can really have a measurement and framework from which to improve. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit more around how to ensure that your health scores are not just providing data, but also being actioned upon. And then finally, we'll wrap up with ways that you can improve accuracy and driving more predictable revenue through continuous improvement around your health scores. As we go along here, there will be a couple of polls for you to provide feedback throughout the session, and we'll leave a few minutes at the end as well for Q&A. So if you do have any questions as we're going along, feel free to type them into the chat, and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in around how do we do a good job of creating a baseline for our health scores. So, whether you have health scores today or are really more in the camp of trying to improve the accuracy of their health scores, the first thing that we really want to look at is what is the baseline from which we're starting with, so that we can measure both the accuracy today as well as continuous improvement throughout that. At Churn Zero, one of the things that we're doing is really enabling our clients to centralize the data points you have on your customer from multiple sources. So those might include things like CRM information, email and calendar engagements, billing, ticketing information, and of course, product usage as well for those of us who are in the SaaS world. The importance of this is really to think about how can we use all of these different data points and craft a health score that's going to be representative of not just our overall client base, but even specific segments within that. So what we usually recommend is starting with about 5 to 7 different key factors that you might want to track if you're first doing this for the first time. And those should be a healthy mixture of both quantitative and qualitative factors as some of your data points. So, when I'm talking about qualitative factors, what I'm talking about there are really those criteria that are usually non-numerical in nature, but can still impact a customer's likelihood to renew. One of the most popular ones we see is CSM sentiment. How does the CSM actually feel about that relationship? So that might take into account, additional factors like the relationship quality of the customer. How engaged are they? Are they responding to, our emails, attending regular training sessions, responding to requests? But it could also include things like your risk rating. Do they fit into our ideal client profile? How mature are their processes relative to other customers we might have? The other types of factors that we want to make sure we're covering here are going to be those more quantitative factors. So typically these are going to be a little bit more objective and include things like maybe support ticket history, specific usage metrics like login frequency or time spent in app, survey results that we might be getting from NPS, CSAT, or customer effort scores, and the like. So with this baseline, one of the things you might consider doing is actually applying different churn scores to different types of customers as well. So maybe an enterprise churn score versus a small business, one for your brand new clients that are going through onboarding versus those clients that have been with us for a specific period of time, as we definitely expect those types of customers to interact with us in certain different ways. Before we do talk a little bit more about some of the ways that we can segment these customers, I do want to invite you to share in your first poll how your team currently applies health scoring criteria. Just understanding a little bit more, is it the same for everyone, or are you tracking specific account attributes to determine which health score you might apply to each client? So the poll should be up now. Feel free to fill that out with the most appropriate answer for your organization. And we'll give everyone a second to do that here. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of responses coming in. Why don't we go ahead and close out the poll. It looks like we've got a pretty good sample here of customers. So this is actually great. We have a lot of different responses. Looks like about 30% of you are using customer account tiers. Others of you are using lifecycle stages. And then the most popular response is other. Would love to hear from you as well in the chat, what some of those other metrics that you might be using are actually in your particular organization. But let's go ahead and move on to talk a little bit more about when we're segmenting out these clients, how can we make these scores more actionable from that perspective? And the reason this is important is because all of your clients, of course, are not the same. So really, in order to make your health scores more actionable and predictive, you'll want to consider segmenting out clients based on how they fit into your overall customer base. So when we're looking at how those clients fit into our overall customer base in Churn Zero, for example, we'll actually use those different client segments to automatically assign them a health score that's most appropriate for them. So I previewed a few different ways we've seen our customers do that, and specifically, make their churn scores more actionable. But let's just focus in on a couple for purposes of today's session. So one of those ways might be based on their account tier. That was about 30% of you in our poll. And when you're thinking about segmenting out your customers based on account tier, think about the size of those customers. So that could be things like their total contract value, their overall number of employees, or even the number of users within their organization. And why this is important is the way that you interact with your enterprise clients versus your small business clients, for example, is going to be quite different in terms of the engagement model. So enterprise CS, we typically think of as a much higher touch model, with each CSM maybe responsible for a handful or a couple dozen clients. Because of this, enterprise CSMs are usually going to have a little bit better pulse on the health of their accounts just from those interactions. And that's something we're going to want to capture within our health scoring metrics, is that idea of how does the CSM actually rate that particular engagement. Conversely, when we're thinking about the small business CSMs, they may handle dozens or hundreds of accounts. And so we're going to want to rely on things that are going to be more indicative in terms of usage metrics. How often are they logging in? As well as customer feedback and engagement. Are they interacting with our CSM team? Are they opening support tickets? and what sort of scores are they getting on the NPS or other surveys we may be sending to them. So we're going to want to weigh that more heavily, since they're going to be more of those low tech or tech touch engagements. So one of the things within Churn Zero that we look at is creating multiple health scores and automatically assigning those, so that when we have a brand new enterprise client, we make sure that we're measuring them by the right criteria within their overall customer lifecycle. Another great example that has come up for us this year is thinking about what are those maybe secondary health scores that could still impact a customer's likelihood to renew or churn. So when the COVID-19 pandemic started, what we really started to look at was we realized that a lot of our customers' businesses and the way that this was impacting them was pretty heavily dependent, number one, on their industry that they were in. Obviously, we saw customers from retail be heavily impacted versus some of the more sales enablement and collaboration tools. They were pretty healthy. We also realized that things were changing much more quickly than normal. So instead of looking at usage metrics from month over month or quarter over quarter perspective, we actually looked at things from when it is their next renewal date, how long have they been with us, and also thinking about shorter periods of time where we're measuring those things to appropriately adapt and better predict what was going on with those customers. So hopefully that gives you some sense in terms of what the different types of churn scores or health scores you might want to be creating would be for your organization, and making sure that our scoring criteria are not overly broad, so that we can mitigate that risk of churn and really be more proactive. At this point, I realize some of you might be thinking to yourselves, like, okay, great, like we do that, but at the end of the day, there's still surprises, right? And that impacts your ability to accurately forecast to management, to accurately forecast to the board. And I do want to address that in a moment, but before we do that, I do want to pull up our second poll question of the day, which is more around how often you actually review your health scoring criteria, or if you are reviewing health scoring criteria today. So I'll give you guys a few moments to respond, and then we'll talk more specifically about what are some of the steps we can do to improve forecasting. Okay. Getting some good responses here. Why don't we go ahead and close out that poll and see what the results are here. So a pretty good mix. Most of you are actually reviewing these monthly or quarterly, which is fantastic to hear. And looks like about 13% equal on annually and never. So, why do I ask this question, and why is it important? So when we're thinking about health scoring, one of the things that we do want to make sure is we have that regular review cadence when we're reviewing client outcomes and adapting that based on exactly what we are seeing here. So let's talk about reviewing client outcomes specifically and how that might impact the way that you adapt your health scoring. So I talked about setting those regular review periods. What we recommend is they should be at least a couple times a year. It's awesome to see that many of you are doing them more frequently than that. And it's partially going to be dependent on your specific industry. Here at Churn Zero, we work with a lot of subscription-based businesses, and particularly B2B SaaS companies whose products are constantly evolving. So one of the reasons that having this regular review period is so important is as a SaaS organization, your product is constantly evolving and you're adding new features, you're making product enhancements. Your customers, therefore, are engaging with your products or services in different ways. And really at a high level, anytime you expect customers to engage with those products or services differently, your health score should certainly be reviewed and should most likely change. So setting those regular review periods to make sure that we are adapting how we're measuring the client health and being able to forecast that over time is going to be really important as we're thinking about how we can stay on top of any needed changes. The second part of this is understanding more of the aggregate data. So once you have that regular review cadence in place, you want to start asking yourself questions about the overall book of business. How has the change in health score impacted my healthy clients, my medium risk clients, my at-risk clients? And when you're going through these, you also want to dig into exceptions within that aggregate data. So ask yourself questions and setting up reports to identify those exceptions. Have we had a customer unexpectedly renew? Have we had a customer or customers unexpectedly churn? These are probably the biggest red flags that indicate that you need to revisit the factors or possibly just adjust the weighting of each of those factors within your health scoring metrics. It's really important that when we're looking at that aggregate data, we can also drill into those specific exceptions to identify areas for improvement. The third part of this is going to be soliciting feedback. So once we've identified those exceptions, and really any time you have a customer churn or you have a customer renew, it's a great opportunity for us to learn from what we're hearing, both from our customers as well as to hear from our CSMs. So it's an opportunity really for us as a company and a CS organization to learn and mature. So one way to solicit feedback is to have both the CSM and the customer fill out information around why that customer is churning or why that customer is renewing. You can use this for clients who churn to compare, why does the CSM think they renewed versus why the CSM thinks they churned versus why the customer thinks they churned. And that can help you identify maybe areas that we haven't foreseen or gaps that we're not tracking today. You might want to consider incorporating in your health score. So this is going to help us identify those factors, those weightings that we need to add or remove. And it also gives you really vital information about the value that your customer sees or hasn't seen in using your product and services that can be expanded across the entire organization, not just the CS team, but also thinking about the ideal client profile, new sales, how is product building out the application. So really, this is invaluable feedback, and I really encourage all of you to implement some sort of specific feedback loop like this if you're not already doing that today. And then obviously, we talked about it before, do it again. So going back to setting those regular review periods, monthly or quarterly is fantastic. But really, anytime we're getting the feedback, maybe that's from our finance team in terms of where we're seeing trends, is a great opportunity for us to actually review those health scores. So I hope that this has given you a little bit of food for thought in terms of how you can do a better job of starting to predict those revenues and some real actionable takeaways. So if you don't have that baseline today, make that baseline. Make sure that it's not just a blanket baseline of your health scoring, but health scores are not one size fits all. So let's figure out whether it is those customer account tiers or other criteria that we're using to really segment our clients and assign them the most appropriate score based on the type of customer that they are. Review those outcomes, make sure that we're seeing it both at the aggregate level as well as at those individual exception levels, and use that data to finally come back and really optimize what you need to be doing to consistently see improvement across how predictable those health scores are. So I want to thank you all for taking the time today and move into a little bit of Q&A in the few minutes that we have left. As I mentioned, feel free to log in any questions that you might have here in the questions bar, and we'll do our best to get to those. Let me just see if we have anything coming in. So it does look like we have one question here. Let's see. So this person asks, our team is trying to move from a more reactive support type approach to a proactive approach with customers. And while being able to see customer health is useful, it still seems somewhat reactive because I have to go digging through the data. What are your suggestions on how to get this info in front of our team more quickly so we can action on it before it becomes a problem? So that's a great question. And one of the things that I would say to that is when you're thinking about actioning and using this, what you really want to do is set up specific alerts, or even in Churn Zero, we can set up automated plays or cadences of outreach to really address these things when they're happening in real time. So part of that is making sure that you have real-time data that you're working with. So as soon as you can get that product information into, whether it's the software solution or your team, that can act as sort of the trigger for any of these alerts or automated cadences in terms of processes to start getting in front of these before they really become a problem. The other thing that I would suggest is making sure that there's gradation within your health score specifically. So for example, if one of your health score metrics is we want our customers to be logging in to our platform at least 10 times a month, let's say. Maybe that counts for 30 out of 100 points of our health score, but we don't just want it to be an all or nothing thing. So, 30 points if they are logging in 10 or more times. Maybe if they're at 5 to 9 times, we give them half those points, 15. And if they're 1 to 4 times, they're 0 points. And that'll really help you not only focus in on those customers that are more at risk, but also make sure that you know which customers to really be prioritizing there. And it looks like we have another question in here. So this is from someone who has a high-touch CS team. They say, we have a good pulse on our relationship and we weight CSM sentiment pretty heavily. However, we find that depending on the specific CSM who owns the account, creates variance in how predictive that might be. How can we make that factor more consistent? So when we're thinking about CSM sentiment, obviously that's something that can be a little bit more subjective than some of our other criteria like product usage or really data-driven quantitative things. What I would say is to think about what goes into that CSM sentiment. So what you might want to consider is setting guidelines around what minimum criteria actually need to be met in order for the sentiment of the CSM to be green versus yellow or red. So some of the things you could think about within that context could be things like, does the customer need to attend a certain number of trainings per year? Or, do we have to make sure that our executive sponsor has not left the company? Do they need some sort of minimum usage to attain one of those levels. So those are all kind of minimum criteria that we want to set up to say, okay, in order for a customer to actually be green in our CSM sentiment score, we at least need some minimum form of engagement, which particularly for your high touch teams should be pretty easy and relevant for them to get from that perspective. Let me just see here if there are any other questions. So I've got one here. Is there any tip on assigning specific scores to different factors? How can I make sure that I prioritize the right factor over something less important? So I think there are a couple things to keep in mind there. One is going to be thinking about, number one, just making sure that you have a healthy mix of those quantitative versus qualitative factors when you're looking at which factors that you want to include. And then I think the other part is really reviewing those regularly, right? So we have to create that baseline up front. That's going to give us those initial indicators as to which factors might be most important. I would also encourage you to make sure that you're talking to your customers about this, right? So when we're soliciting that feedback from them, whether they just renewed or even looking at things like customer reviews that you might have, look at some overall trends in terms of what are customers saying they're getting the most value out of, and that can be a really great indicator as to what we should actually be looking at there. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. Let me see what we have here. I've got one here. If you incorporate a feedback loop direct from a client who has renewed, and that feedback results in the need to update one or two of the metrics, how do you incorporate those changes into the existing baseline? So what we recommend, and one of the priorities and one of the really important things about being able to create multiple health scores, is keep that baseline. Just don't make it the primary. So that way we can actually look back and say, okay, we made these adjustments to the health score. Now, did it actually impact the overall likelihood of how we can better predict? So if you have that new health score, you also have as a kind of secondary health score that you're just monitoring the old health score. That'll give you a really good indication as to if you are actually improving the accuracy and predictability of that score. I know that there are some other questions that I was unable to get to. Feel free to email any of those over to me, rbecker@churnzero.net, and we'll do our best to respond to each of them as we go along. But I do want to thank all of you for joining today's session. Hope it was helpful, and we will see you next time on the next Churn Zero Business Impact webinar. Thanks, everyone.